And let's see here. We are live.
Live.
From New York.
There we are. We are live.
Okay, fantastic.
I suppose we're all wondering who asked us here today.
Wait a minute.
Yes.
Where am I?
Well, let me tell you where you are. You are at Nerdy Shop Talk. So this is an endeavor by Julie Dirksen and I, where we have gone to many different conferences, like I believe you have, and some of the things that the places we learn the most is when we're sitting around just chatting with our peers and our colleagues and just talking about different topics that are interesting to us and we think will move our industry a little bit more forward. So this is what this endeavor is. It's a moment for you to listen in as we have some of these conversations and just for you to eavesdrop on them. We do have a chat that you are welcome to chat back and forth with myself, and I'll be moderating that for our speakers and our guests that we have with us. I'll introduce Julie, our co-host here. Julie is an instructional designer and the author of Design How People Learn, one of the best-selling or a best-selling instructional design book that we have. She is an international speaker and an instructor and is recognized as a guild master with the e-learning guild.
And I'll quickly introduce our other co-host, Tracy Parrish. Tracy is just one of those people who gets things done, and she's an educational technology specialist. And she can kind of do all the parts. She does instructional design, project management, development, although we were just talking about the challenges with being asked to do too many things. So maybe we'll have an episode later on the sort of role of instructional designers. But she's a frequent speaker at industry and events and an articulate community hero and one of the moderators for Learn Chat. She also keeps a fantastic list of free e-learning resources, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
And our guest that we have with us today to talk about the research rabbit hole is we have Jane Bozarth, who's an author and director of the research at the e-learning guild. Clark Quinn is also an author and executive director of Quinn OGrady. And Patti Shank is an internationally recognized information and instructional designer, writer, and author as well.
Yep. And so our topic today is the research rabbit hole, which is basically how do we help people with research-based practice? We know that it would be better if people were using solutions that were based on our best knowledge that we have from the academic research, but that can be a really hard thing for practitioners to do. And it's not always realistic for a busy practitioner with a full-time job to keep up on all the academic journals and research studies. And so the big question today that we wanted to talk about is sort of how do we help people with that, or how do we make that more effective in our industry? And we specifically asked Clark and Patti and Jane because they're all champions of this, of actual evidence-based practice, using the academic research, trying to make sure that what we do has some validity based on the best things that we know about the learning science. So anyway, to get started, just quickly from your own point of view, and whoever wants to tackle this one first, why should we even care about this? Is craft and practice enough, or is this a really important thing that we need to think about? Why do we care about evidence-based practice?
I will happily address that. I addressed that recently in my book. There are several reasons why this is important. The first one is wasting time and money. People could be spending money on practices that are just not helpful. They could be, trying to make redundant content for different learning styles, a variety of things. And they could be purchasing tools or techniques on promises that are vaporware. And that would be bad enough. But what really bugs me is that it could actually be damaging to the learning outcomes you're trying to achieve. Some of these things will actually send you, having you do things to learners that will interfere with their learning, will overload their learning, send them rot. And that to me is why we should care. And I guess the final reason is we're supposed to be professional. We wouldn't go to a surgeon who's practicing on the basis of astrology or so the same reason we should be knowing what we're doing, know the basis that underpins our profession.
Mm-hmm. Jane or Patti, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I've got something. To me, it's just simply obvious. Good outcomes in every line of work, in every task, are based on the research, even if people don't know that they are. I'll give you an example. Someone who does carpentry has to have a mastery of certain areas of science. If they don't have mastery of geometry and physics, even though they may not realize that that's what they're using, their outcomes are poor. And so that's true of everything. It's true of medicine. It's true of librarians. We do what we do best when our practice is informed by science. And that's all evidence-based means. It's that the best science has to offer at that moment.
Jane, anything else?
I was just, when Clark was talking, and Patty's right. I think that maybe we need to start changing the way we talk about it. Maybe we just need to say based on science and get rid of that evidence word. Maybe that's the stumbling block. But when Clark was talking, I just kept thinking, we complain, and I mean, as an industry, as a business, there's a lot of complaining that we aren't taken seriously and we can't get this imaginary seat at this table. And, it doesn't help when we have so much practice that is not based in anything sound, that is just based on what seems to be fun at the moment, what some whim was this morning, and we've got dancing cats all over the PowerPoint, So I think in our endeavor to be taken more seriously and to be seen as a credible source of practice, that supplying evidence and adhering to what we know to be sound principles is bound to help position us in a better place.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Nope, that completely makes sense to me. And, if we don't have some of those kinds of things, it does turn into this sort of war of opinions. I think the best thing to do is X. I think the best thing to do is Y. And, whoever sort of has the most authority in the room can often be the person who wins in that case, even if it's not ultimately a good choice. So.
I've seen that happen a couple of times when I've cited something, say in Learn Chat or in a Twitter feed. I'll say, well, yada, 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 research said, da, 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 and it was experimental stuff. It wasn't, just bloviating. And somebody will immediately say, well, I think, and then it's followed by an anecdote, a single anecdote, or, one day at my job, this happened. So I think that's a really good point. It shouldn't be a war of opinion. It shouldn't be alternative facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. The plural of anecdote is not data.
It's not data.
Yep.
Right.
So.
And yet, many times you can get in that conflict. You get people who telling you, oh, well, our stuff is scientifically validated. And somebody else saying, and others of us are saying, no, it's not. And then you have to dig deeper. I may be anticipating a question coming up, Julie.
Yeah, just a little bit. So what's the best format to help people? Like, what have you found that's been most effective? Because one of the things is if you put some of these academic journals in front of people, very reasonably, they get overwhelmed by it, right? There's a lot of statistics in there. There's a lot of those kinds of things. But we also know that there's a danger to kind of oversimplifying too much, where you sort of distill out some of the important context that is necessary to understand exactly what this research is saying. Patti, I know you deal with this a lot because you do such a beautiful job of trying to kind of formulate, clear recommendations in your books and things. So maybe you want to take that one on first.
Yeah, I think that the best way to do this is to understand the problems that instructional designers, trainers, subject matter experts deal with when trying to teach skills to others, and talk about the 80-20 rule. What are the 20% of issues that cause 80% of the problems? So cognitive load comes in there. There's all sorts of things. I tackled writing first, writing from a comprehension point of view. Is that we can't just write, we can't just present. We've got to do it in a way that makes sense for people. And thank you for your nice comments about how I've done it. But let me also say that first book and the books were not my first effort. And my first 3 or 4 efforts failed miserably. I had a group of people who agreed to read my stuff. And the first time I did it, basically they said, this sucks, and your stuff sucks. Don't even bother. So after having, you know, a month to two pity party, I went back to the drawing board. So, you know, I think we cannot provide to people every single thing they need to know from the research, but we can pick out the things that are most critical and teach people enough. I love your comment about how much to put in, how much to leave out. And that's a real issue. There's a lot of nuance in this cognitive load, for an example, tons of nuance. If we provide all the nuance, no one will get it. If we provide none of it, they'll do the same thing for people with lots of prior knowledge and people with no prior knowledge. Mm-hmm. And that's not okay either. So I think there's a tension there. I don't have a definitive answer here.
What's something that you changed from like the first draft effort to then your later stuff that you did?
Oh my God, what didn't I change? Well, okay, I can give you some examples. I don't use cognitive load as a word right off the bat in most of my books. I call it mental effort because people understand what mental effort is. But right. I called it cognitive load to start out with. I called prior knowledge, and now I tend to use what the amount they already know. So doing some translation, and then I need to know my own audience's prior knowledge, because if they understand a lot of what I'm talking about, I can go into the nuances. I can use the terms that are used. Mm-hmm. I had to make a decision about what terms to use, and sometimes I used the actual terms, sometimes I didn't, and sometimes I transitioned from mental effort to cognitive load, and I did that through a thought process, so that by the end I'm using cognitive load. So because I want you to know that word, mm-hmm. because other people are going to use it and they're not going to use mental effort.
Right. Oh, I love that. That makes complete sense. Clark or Jane, what kinds of stuff have you dealt with? Maybe Jane, you want to address it because you do the research reports for the e-learning guild, and you have to kind of figure out what level to set those things at as well.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I think Patti and I probably talked about this years ago when I was working on my own dissertation. I remember in graduate school, there was a lot of conversation. You know, as you said, the academic journals are often written almost in a second language. They are largely inaccessible to people who have not had training to read that kind of stuff. And I remember in grad school, we kicked around a whole lot of conversation about, well, who is research for? If the only people who can read it are other people who write it, you know, where do we translate? I think is one of the things you're talking about, because it's written in such a different way. But the most recent issue I ran into where this was a big concern was we did a report last summer on learning styles. That's 10,000 words. It's 32 or 3 or 4 pages where I reviewed piles of experimental literature. I tried to look through why this had caught on so much, why this was such a popular idea, what was making it maintain the foothold. And it was all very interesting, but you have to decide from that preponderance of stuff what you're going to go with. So I did discuss those things, and Clark has done that a lot with his new book, the Goldfish book. But one thing that came out of that I think is important when we start talking about a war of opinion, as we did in the other question, and when we talk about what's worth pursuing and what's worth talking about. When I was working on the learning style stuff, you know, some people have very strong opinions about that. Also about things like personality type. And whatever it is, Kathy Moore had done a really nice job with some blog posts reminding us that people are not badly intended. They're not glomming onto this stuff because they want to do the wrong thing. They think that they're making stuff better or more engaging or more tailored or more targeted. They believe they're doing the right thing, and just wrangling with them about, well, you're wrong and here's the evidence, is not really going to help very much. So she writes a lot of stuff about, okay, how can we have better conversations with people about these things and not just feel like you're stomping on them. And as she says, and I think I'm even quoting here, she says, you cannot argue with somebody who's operating from a moral imperative, right? So so figuring out how we can not only translate, but also present that in a way that people don't feel like they're being put down or told everything they've done is stupid or what you were doing doesn't make sense, I think is also part of our challenge. Am I answering your question?
You totally are answering my question, and that's a huge issue. Clark, I'll loop to you in just a sec, but one of the things, there's a game designer who went into e-learning and now he's doing some other stuff, but Jane and I both know him, Rick Raymer, and I remember when he told me that he felt like his job as a game designer was to make people feel smart. It wasn't to entertain people, it was to make them feel smart. When they'd solve a puzzle in a game or something, they'd have this feeling of like, whoa, I get that. That was amazing. And I feel like we lose track of that. We're like, some of the stuff that berates people for not using evidence-based practice is, we're going to make you feel dumb because you're not doing this, as opposed to, hey, we're giving you tools to make you feel smart and make you feel powerful and make you feel confident in your role. And so I think, yeah, absolutely, that tone piece is hugely important. And I'll let Clark go because I know he's got stuff to say.
Well, it's just that one part of it that Jane was referring to at the end. When people have wrong beliefs, it can be hard. Now, again, if it's tied into their value system, you have a much deeper issue. But if it's just they've believed this for a while and they're hooked into it, one of the things I try to do in the book, and I wrote an article for ATD about confronting beliefs, and you want to acknowledge the reason that belief sounds valid. Learning styles. We know learners differ. There's no argument. But the problem is it changes so much. So you give them then an explanation about how that's right, but how we can't deal with it now. You can point to what the research says, but first you've acknowledged it. And then a really important thing to me is and give them an alternative. That's what I tried to do in the book with, here's what's plausible. Here's what the research says, however, here's why so it's actually not valid, but here's what you should do instead. And if you can steer them that way, that's a really useful way to deal with these things. And of course, always tell stories. That's always a good way to help communicate.
Right. The other thing I would add to that, I don't think I'm hijacking us to a different question, is one of the things I'm trying to do with this job is not just to offer the evidence, but also to help people understand the reality of research. A great deal of what's available, particularly in the empirical literature, a great deal was done with convenient samples, right? Often college undergraduates and not necessarily people in the workplace. Very often, when you read through a study, and I know Patti does a lot of work with this, you will see that their conclusion doesn't match what they said they were out to study. Right? They have this very compelling long article, but what they're proving isn't, or saying they're proving isn't the thing they tested, right? So helping people sort of make sense of how research is conducted, who it was conducted with, when it was conducted. I know that Julie and I went out to the Stanford Medical School not long ago. We had gone out to look at one VR lab and ended up doing an experiment for another. And, we're grown-ups who were doing this because we had time to do it that day, but it's driving to Stanford, getting there, getting where we needed to be. I would say overall, it was probably 3 or 4 hours of our day, and they gave us a t-shirt and $8, right? So where people are getting where people are being drawn into the studies, who's participating in them matters. And I remember in particular one day someone, I don't remember, I think it was just a Twitter conversation. Someone said, well, I'm not interested in literature I'm not interested in research that's more than 3 years old. Well, if you know how the publishing process works, good luck finding very many things that are newer than 3 years. I mean, you may be looking at stuff that's 5 years old by the time it actually sees light of day, right? The experiment was done in 2015, and then it got published in 2018. So helping people sort of understand what they're really looking at and how it was written and where it came from, I think is also important, apart from just the details of the research itself. That makes sense.
Well, and I've got a question on this a little bit later, but one of the things that I feel like is always a useful thing to do whenever it makes sense, if it's a key point or something, is trying to explain a little bit about how the research was conducted. Because the issue, and actually we'll just go ahead and segue into this question, but trying to explain a little bit about how the research is conducted. So, this is what they tested against, this was the control condition, here's what they found, because things get generalized too much. We know that this happens, right? The one about or the Moravian stuff, so much is communicated through tone or body language or whatever. I mean, that's presented as a series of percentages like it's a real thing. And if you understand how the research was done, it's interesting and perfectly good research. But if you try to generalize it out to stuff, then then it becomes this sort of nonsense statistic that gets thrown around. So how do people know who to trust? Because a lot of people are out there talking about stuff, right? And I see stuff out there that purports to be science-based, or brain-friendly is a term that gets thrown around a lot, that kind of moved on a little bit from neuroscience. And neuroscience gets thrown around a ton, and that's a whole, I could kind of rant about that for about probably 45 minutes. But you know, how do people know who to trust, aside from the fact that they're on this video cast right now, and obviously we're all trustworthy, but what should they be looking for when they're reading stuff?
One of the things is defining what good research is and understanding that. I've had this conversation. I can't remember whether I've had it with you. I think I have, about we're not talking about a study ever. Mm-hmm. We're talking about what does the preponderance of research done in various contexts using various methods and having it replicated over and over. That's the only research we're really that heavily interested in. Mm. And that requires people who can read, I don't know, 200 studies, look for the themes across them. Where's the agreement? Where's the disagreement? What audiences are they talking about? One of the things I had a specifically hard time doing in all three books was finding the research in a training setting, where they were dealing with people who were in training settings. And the best part of this whole experience for me was finding the 15, 20, 30 training researchers that we can go look at their stuff and then looking across. You know, so for me, it's all about preponderance. Generalizability looks at audience, but also preponderance. What does the research say? Like, we don't have a lot of questions left about whether cognitive load causes problems when teaching people new skills. We know a lot about that. Mm-hmm. Whereas other things, I did something for e-learning industry recently on one study about video, and people, and it's not a meta-analysis. It's not a study about studies. It's one study, but the N was, I don't remember, 60,000, very high, lots of people. So I just talked about that one. Mm-hmm. But again, that wasn't preponderance. I was talking about what we can learn from that study. And so for me, it's all about how much we've looked at the bulk of literature, not just a study. You can always find a study.
Right.
Well, and I want to be even more specific about this, because, you know, you'll see an article and they'll tell you that this is brain-based learning, or they'll tell you that it takes 60 tries to form a habit, or they'll tell you that
10,000 hours.
That 10,000 hours, or that it takes 80% of meaning is derived from tone and body language, or, you know, any of these kinds of things. And it sounds kind of officially, right? I used to be in meetings and we'd be talking about a design thing, and I'd say, well, there's some research that says this, and people go, oh, okay. And people were really impressed when I did that. And I always had the research because I'm, try to be ethical about these things. But I realized somewhere early on, I'm like, I could make this up and nobody's going to call me on it. Right. Nobody's going to ask to see my list of citations. Right. I could give them to you. I do have them, but nobody's going to call me on this, and I can make up anything I want. So if somebody's reading an article and somebody says that 97% of blue interfaces cause better learning outcomes than green interfaces, how does that person know that that is totally not real, by the way, just to be clear. But, you know, if somebody says something, how do you look at that? I mean, like, one of the things, I think I tweeted something about this, Patti, where I was like, oh, Patti's resource section, like reference sections at the end of her articles always make me happy. So that's something. There should be.
That's half for me. I'd love to know, are there other ways of doing it? I just want to show you the research that I used to write this.
Right. Well, that's a bare minimum, right? Like, there should be some research behind it. Is there other stuff?
I want to separate out two things. So when you're actually looking at research, you know, well, first, if somebody presents it to you, you cut it down and say, is this actually relevant for me? Does it mean what I do differently? And then you track back and say, who's telling me this? And what Patti was saying, are more than one person saying this, that lends validity to it, particularly if they're independent and stuff. But if they pass that test, then you've got to get into, I think, what you're talking about, Julia, going a little deeper and saying, you know, there's the whole methodology. Did they, you know, use the right subjects? Did they ask a good question? Did their methods align with the question? Did they get sufficient quantity of subjects for validity? Did they do a power test? There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes in it. And at some point, I'm thinking that's beyond what most practitioners should be able to do, you know. And then you give it the sniff test. So the second thing, and I'm going to slightly disagree with Patti. I agree with Patti said about, you know, replicated studies, but there's one other source. So even with cognitive load, that tends to be most of the stuff Sweller's done. But there are people who've done persistent studies in a field for a long time, and then they can summarize it. And I take, you know, they're pointing to the research, so it's not a whole bunch of different people, but these are people deeply involved. And so you could look at, you know, David Merrill, for instance. He's done a whole body of research and revised his theoretical foundations 3 times now. And you know, it's converging in a good way. So at some point you want to start looking at people, and I think the number of references at the end is a great test. And, you know, I think Patti does a fabulous job, but people who've looked at a bunch of stuff and synthesized it, or are pointing to a whole bunch of studies that they know that they're bringing in. The one thing you want to worry about when somebody brings you a study and says, we did the study, and this, I think it's directly to your question, Julie, about blue versus green. Who's telling you, and is that research, you know, peer published? Has it been open to scrutiny?
Right.
But I'm not sure everybody should be expected to be able to do that level of research. So then the question becomes, how do you find trusted people? And I think it's triangulation. When you got, you know, somebody like Will Thalheimer reads hundreds of journal articles every year, and, you know, Patti, who continues to drive research, and Julie, who, you know, has shown a fabulous talent for digesting research, and Jane as well. I mean, that's when you start. It's triangulation. Who all is pointing to one another reputably?
Yeah. Before this gets away from me, you know, you're talking about how you appreciate Patti's bibliographies at the end of her pieces. Years ago, we lost him last year. We had a LearnChat moderator and a pretty well known on the interwebs guy named Kelly Smith, who said that people's bibliographies used to be his Google. Thank you. But Patti said something I think better than I did when she was talking about looking for studies that were done in the workplace. When I was talking about the convenience sample, that's a problem when you have an academic who wants to do some experimentation. Their convenient people are the undergraduates and sometimes maybe student teachers who think an $8 reward in a t-shirt is, is a big deal. But when we start talking about trying to find studies that were done in workplaces, it becomes very, very challenging. These people, for one thing, they have to work. They don't have time to be in our study. Organizations sometimes don't want to give you access. I had friends who were like trying to do master's theses or dissertations, and often the organization wanted access to the data before it was made public, and they wanted to write to massage that if they didn't like the way something turned out. So I mean, there's challenges when we start talking about trying to get workplace studies. I agree. I wish there were many, many more. Yeah. Because honestly, I don't have a problem with the undergrads. If that's what you've got, use them. But their job is to go to school. They are not distracted adult learners in the middle of a divorce with a sick child or, whatever else is going on their plates, and a boss beating on the door wanting to know when they're going to be done with this training because we need them back at work. On the issue of who do we trust, I agree with Clark. I look at people who don't seem to be trying to sell me the green screen. Right? They're not telling me the research says you should use green background, because look, we sell that. I look for people like Kathy Moore and Walt Hallheimer and David Merrill and some of those folks. I look at Google Scholar. I look to see what is most cited. You know, when I'm looking at a topic, I look to see who seems to have the most citations for learning styles or cognitive load or memory or multimedia effects. And that's when you start seeing people like Rich Mayer and Ruth Clark a lot. Now, it can be sometimes that they have the most citations because it's 50 years old, and you have to know that, but it can be that they have the most citations because it's good stuff, and I usually will take a look at that. One thing that has emerged, and there's a fellow out of, I want to say he's at University of Georgia, Josh Cuevas, is doing a good deal of work about problems in our business, education in particular, with predatory journals. That's a new thing. That's been happening the last few years, where an author pays, and it's often a lot of money, just to get published in something that looks like a real peer-reviewed journal. Sometimes that's academics who are just desperate to look like they're publishing, and I get that. But one of the things that came out when I was looking at learning styles is that virtually every study that said that they had found a positive correlation between teaching to learning style and an outcome performance-wise had published that in a predatory journal, not in a real one. So there's just a lot of issues when you start talking about trust. So I would look at names that pop up a lot. I would do what Clark said and look at triangulation. I would do what Patti says and start looking at workplace studies. Not that we're suspicious of other things, but we got to figure out where legitimate stuff is coming from.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting set of problems, because I think some of this stuff is our problem, like knowing which ones are the predatory journals, or knowing if somebody's research methods are good. I think that's this group. That's our problem. I think that's an unreasonable ask, and I think Clark, you alluded to this, that's kind of an unreasonable ask for somebody who's at the practitioner level. I would just like the practitioner level folks to be able to kind of sniff test articles when they're reading them in different publications, so having a resource section or reference section, if they reference a piece of research, they tell you who did it and what year, whether it's parenthetical or footnotes, or, however you note it. One of the things that I saw a lot, I was reviewing a series of conference proposals for a Science of Learning track for a conference. And one of the things I was seeing is that some of the people who were saying some stuff that I thought was questionable in and of itself, if they cited any references, they were tending to cite secondary sources. So things like John Medina's Brain Rules or Daniel Goleman's books, or, something like that, where it's already been through this sort of translation process, or David Rock's stuff, and the neuro leadership people and things like that, where, they've got, I like that look, Clark, that was great, where they've got, some reasonable basis for these things that are happening. Whether they get translated well is a different question, but I think that they've got, they have actual neuroscience people. They have, John Medina's great, Daniel Goleman's great. These are really good people, but once somebody does the translation process, it turns into that game of telephone. Like, I was reading nonsense stuff about the basal ganglia for years after one of David Rock's pieces on neuroscience and leadership, where it was just being used in this kind of nonsensical way. But I think people felt like, hey, I can say something smart about neuroscience, and so I'm going to trot this stat out that I learned from Daniel Rock. But because it had gotten so stretched out from the original source, it had gotten to be, they were saying kind of ridiculous things. And again, I think from Kathy Moore's point, with absolutely the best will in the world, they had learned something they thought was cool, and they wanted to share it with other people, and they wanted to be helpful, as they're talking about this stuff, but they didn't have enough of an understanding of what they were talking about by the time it had been through these stages that it was meaningful in any way. Also, infographics. For some reason, I think if you put something in an infographic, it shuts off people's critical thinking about, does that even make sense?
Yes.
Especially if it has percentages.
Right.
Yeah, numbers. If it's got numbers and cute, really nice pictures and a good color scheme, it's science.
Right. Well, and being suspicious of convenient numbers too is one of those things. I think very highly of all of the 70, 20, 10 people, but those numbers, you should view them with suspicion. They're way too convenient. right?
They were deliberately made simple, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean they're kind of in an interesting category where I think the things that they're saying all make sense, but these numbers don't, and it's possibly a little unfortunate that they've tied themselves so tightly to the numerical representation as part of their naming, but the material behind it or the recommendations that they're making generally are really good. So
they should have gone with watermelons, apples, grapes, in other words.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. So, and if people can Google that if they want to know what that's about.
Don't you find that people always want to immediately leap on that without even listening to what they're trying to say when people present something like 70-20-10? They immediately latch onto that and don't pay attention to the idea of proportion. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Clark probably knows more. His friend Charles is working on this.
Yeah, and I covered it in the misconceptions part of the book that some people have found it really useful. It's a tool that they've been able to use executives to get to recognize this, and then they can get investment. Nobody's saying you should invest in that proportion or the exact proportion. So, if you forget about the numbers and just if you find it useful to help make the case to go beyond the course, boom, use it. If not, don't.
Yeah. So how do we? Or actually, I'm going to go with a different one. What's a reasonable sort of level of base knowledge for a practitioner? What do we expect them to do?
You're talking about research, in knowing research?
Around research and evidence-based practice. What do we think is a reasonable expectation for somebody who's working in the field as a professional?
I think back to the most important concepts, the 20% that make the 80% of the difference. And you'd include how memory works. Cognitive architecture is what the researchers call it, cognitive load, prior knowledge. I haven't broken it down that way, but I think it would be interesting to come up with a taxonomy of research-based, evidence-based, or science-backed training knowledge that people need to have. I don't know. I'm not going to sit here and say I know what it is. I'd have to sit down, and it would be great to do it with a group of people to what are the 20, what's the 100%, or as close as we can get to it, and what's the 20% that everyone needs to know and work with.
I've actually been teaching this in various ways and workshops and stuff, trying to cover what I think are the basics. So I've got a handle on. I think Patti was right with the basic cognitive architecture, sensory stores, working memory, long-term memory, the processes of attention and elaboration and retrieval, the value of practice, and then the nuances around each of the elements of learning. I think we need to include the emotional side. So I talk about introductions that hook them emotionally, to activate relevant knowledge. Practice is critical. They need to understand spaced and deliberate and, practice. They need to understand challenge. They need to understand few nuances and examples like showing the underlying thinking. They need to understand a bit about the concepts, about how models are really useful. And it's that sort of minimum, daily adult requirement now set by the ID government that I think has to be in there. But there's just got to be enough basic learning science that they can make inferences about what to do and what not to do and be able to challenge a claim, at least at the sniff test. I don't expect them to be able to read the original Academy's version, but I expect them to be able to understand the concept.
All right.
If there's a single book I could give everybody in our business for Christmas, a single thing, if there's one thing they could have, it would be a copy of Ruth Clark and Richard Mayer's E-Learning and the Science of Instruction. Because it pretty much covers everything everyone else has already said. And I used it as a weapon early on in my career. I think it's out in about the 4th edition now. But I remember the day I was in a meeting, and because of them, I won a challenge over why we shouldn't narrate every single word in everything we do. Or if we did, we could turn it off. So if there's one thing, I would say go there, and it covers a lot of what's already been discussed, and it's accessible. It's not so hard to grasp, and it's not written in that high level language, and there's lots of examples. So I would say that not even my own books, but somebody else's.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, Clark's most recent book, Clark, what's the title? I'm sorry, I'm bad at it.
Millennial Stonefish and Other Training Misconceptions.
Yes, I think that should be an essential reading thing. I mean, and you did such a really good job of making, I think, most of it accessible to people, or all of it accessible to people, and you know, the kind of consistent format. You had your 3 different categories in that, which I thought was really nice, of like myths that were completely wrong, and then
superstition.
Yeah, go ahead and you say them. I'm gonna get them wrong, but
myths that are completely wrong, superstitions that are practices, and I think people are not even conscious about it, just become ingrained and yet are silly. And then I would and then the misconceptions, the things that some people love and some people hate, and trying to just figure out when does it make sense and when should you avoid it. I want to, I like Ruth Clark and Dick Mayer's E-Learning and the Science of Instruction, but to me, it's not a book you read through. It's a reference book you look in when you're trying to find issues. Actually, Julia, I think your book, Designed for How People Learn, did a really good job of taking that science and mapping it through the process. And that's what I like about it, because Ruth Clark and Dick Mayer's stuff is more a collection of things by the type of cognitive phenomena, not the design process you're following. And I think that was a really important thing. I was just talking with Guy Wallace today, because as Patti and Jane know, I'm here in Charlotte to talk to his group. And I was arguing, for instance, performance consulting doesn't have that. They really need a sort of an idiot's guide to performance consulting. It needs to be accessible, so it talks you through the process and helps you unpack and develop the models that give you the guidance to do it. I would buttress it with Clark and Mayer, but I would start with something more aligned to the processes they have to follow, and something they can read and give them that basics, and then they can index in as they go through and raise questions. But I think we've got how many other people to hear from, at least Patti, so we could have at least 2 or 3 more opinions while we go.
Several years ago, our own Tracy Parrish set up a Pinterest board of recommended books for people who are involved in instructional design and training, and here's the link to it in chat.
Oh, yeah, Tracy can put it out. There's a public chat and an internal chat, just so you know.
Okay.
So Tracy can put it out to the public chat. So,
okay.
Yeah, sorry, it's one of those. We'll warn people about that in future. It's one of those. This is our first go around. So, okay. So if you had one myth that bugged you more than any other one, what would it be, or one issue that you see? Is it learning styles? Is it? I'll tell you what mine is. It's unquestionably the whole goldfish attention span thing, which I would happily spend half an hour explaining where that came from and why it was nonsense. But the idea that our attention spans are shorter than a goldfish, yeah, that's the one that's mine. That's the one that I care the most. I mean, I care about all of them, but that's the one. So if you could only pick one, which one would it be?
For me, it'd be microlearning, which is why I ended up spending all that time on what the research actually says about microlearning. I'm kind of past the learning styles thing. I'm not angry about it anymore. I just feel like we should be moving on, and we aren't. But the issue of microlearning is best for what? What exactly? Because that seems to be one of the new fads. We should be using microlearning because it's micro, not so. I did exactly. So I spent. I mean, I don't usually spend months reading research for a single article, but this one I did, and I didn't know what I'd find. So that one's on e-learning industry. I can give you guys the URL for that to put in show notes, but that's the one that followed up by video is good for everything, which I just answered in the last e-learning industry article. It's just like nothing is good for everything.
Yep. And by the way, we're going to try to wrap up on the hour. But Jane, what's yours? What's the one that kind of annoys you the most?
Personality types.
Mm-hmm.
There's a particular one I am still angry about. I'm actually willing to sort of let go of learning styles. I've given up, basically. But I worked in an organization where the wave of personality types came tumbling down every couple of years, and we spent a lot of money getting like trainers certified in that. And when we didn't have money for other things we really needed, and then the cult would pick back up again. So I'm still annoyed about that. I agree with Patti. Some company, we all get a lot of these where, would you answer our 5 questions for a blog post or something? And the other day, someone's first question was, what one thing do you think is overhyped? And I said micro-learning. I said, it's not new, and it's mostly performance support. And it's been around forever, and it's common sense. And so now I've decided, Patti, I'm going to invent hyper micro-learning. So it's short and faster. It's like, you just said that, what's going to be next? What's next year? But the buzzwords do annoy me, but I'm still, honestly, the personality type stuff, for one thing, I'm not going to name the company. You all know who I'm talking about. But the company has there's been serious allegations of ethical issues with how they award their grant money, with who is allowed to be certified and who can sell their product. I mean, there's a lot involved with that that's more than just Jane doesn't like it. But honestly, I could throw, to a point Clark made earlier, I could throw astrology at people and it would be just as valid as anything. There's no construct validity. There's no predictive value. I don't care what personality type my dentist is. I just want him to be nice.
Yeah. Well, Jane, you and I were at that conference once where it was based on Greek myths or something.
Yes.
And it was practically astrology. It was darn close. So,
yeah.
Okay. How about you, Clark?
Well, I ordinarily would pick learning styles just because it's so prevalent. I'm tired of it too, like everybody else. And, you can't kill it. It's like a zombie. It won't die. But I would pick on another one because we've beaten that one to death already. Millennials and the digital native.
Yes.
I mean, goodness gracious, can we be a little bit any less, sort of discriminatory, artificially bucketing people into, how they should be based upon their age?
Yeah, the question I always ask when that one comes up, I'm like, if you could only have one piece of information about your audience, would you want to know their professional background, their education, what their jobs are like, or what year they were born? And if you would pick what year they were born, then you should pay attention to the millennial stuff. But if you would pick any of those other things as being more important to know about your audience, then
right. But Clark's right. I was housed in HR for 20 years, and if we had said the things about any other category of human that we say about millennials, there would have been lawsuits. Seriously. And it's horrible. And I have a feeling that when we were all 25, people were saying that about us.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah. Well, they and they're all spoiled and they don't save money and they and I think they said the same stuff about me.
None of them care about our cultural mores. They're all trying to throw it over. They've been saying that since the times of the ancient Greeks. Come on.
I know.
All right. Okay. So I want to end on a positive note. So just tell me something that you're genuinely excited about in this, either in this arena or in our industry as a whole. What's something that you're looking forward to, you're excited about?
I'm super excited about the fact that research is actually on anyone's radar. And I can't tell you, when I started this about 4 years ago, started just spending most of my time reading research and translating it, I had a pretty good idea that no one would ever read a thing I said. And I'm pleased to announce that people are reading it, asking questions, but I hear people talking about the research says, or what do you think the cognitive load implications of that will be? I'm hearing that from practitioners. I can't tell you, it's just rocking my world.
Yay.
Yeah. I was pleased to hear you were kind enough Julie, to mention the Millennial Stonefish book. So here's a book debunking learning myths. It apparently was the ATD's bestseller last year, which doesn't mean it sells a lot of books, but that was their bestseller. I mean, that to me is promising. And what Patti said too, that people are excited about the book she's coming out on research. I'm giving talks on the millennials, and everybody wants to hear more. They want start hearing about professionalism in practice, it feels like maybe after, how many collective years or decades of us beating our heads against this, we may finally have reached a transition point. And that's,
critical
really.
Mass. I
Yes.
feel like it's critical mass.
It's coming. All right. I had another question, which we'll have to save for another day, but it was about how do we make sure that there's a business model around doing this work?
Yeah.
But that's a different question. So Jane, what's something you're excited about?
Didn't ask that one because I have no clue.
I know, right? Yeah. That's for a different day. But Jane, what's something you're excited about?
Well, I would like to say, to follow up on something that Clark mentioned, it is important that we realize, that we remember that when we talk about trainers or e-learning designers or instructional designers, they're not working in a vacuum. They have stakeholders and bosses and safety people and customer service representatives who are pushing them to do bad things. Just make it pretty, just make it cute, just make it fun, just make it, make it fast. I remember when I moved from the training department to a job that was housed in HR, my frustration at not being able to articulate, why we don't want to do these things, why we don't want to have that stuff, why we're not going to narrate everything, why there won't be dancing cats. And I remember it was a huge relief to know there was research out there. And I do think that people, it's not that they don't want it, it's that they just don't know where to start. And they are looking for words. And I think books like Clark's and the work that Patti's doing help that a whole lot. I do want to say, I didn't get a chance to work this in anywhere, but talking about how people interpret research, there was a certain vendor who had hired what appeared to be, I don't know, they might have been millennials. They appeared to be like college students or something to write content for their blog. And someone somewhere had read something and come to the conclusion and wrote that Jane Hart and Jane Bozarth don't recommend using technology for learning. What? So, you have to look at where these, I don't even know. I can't imagine. I am excited to take a different tack. I'm excited that people are interested in research. I'm excited that people seem to want to know this. I will say, as far as the industry goes, I am very interested to see where augmented reality goes. I'm really excited about the possibilities for that, and I hope we don't gum it up. So that's what I'm thinking about these days. I think there's a lot of potential for AR. I know that VR is sexy and everybody loves it. I see so much potential for AR. I can't even. So there we go.
I so agree, but we'll have to gum it up for a while before the goodness emerges, right?
Hey, Tracy, before we wrap up, was there anything from we're going to get better at this, by the way, but is there anything from the chat that we need to kind of try to hit on quickly?
I think you have covered most of it. There was talk about whether we can find a way to have journal. I've got to find the comment now. Practitioner-facing journals that feature in-depth articles, and David Kelly from the Guild was happy to chime in to say it's actually much more difficult than we would anticipate it to be. Yeah. For the most part, you guys have kept the chat going and answering the questions that are being posted there.
Okay, great. Clark, were you just signaling?
I would say, I think Learning Solutions generally does a good job. eLearn Mag is trying to do that as well. It's deliberately trying to position itself as a link between research and practitioners. To your point, it's very difficult. To David's point, we were for a while doing a Learning Solutions thing. You were part of that, Julie, where we're taking an article and that we thought was relevant and interesting and writing about it. But it's an ongoing battle because it's, part of it is the question, the unasked question about the business model around it. But it's just trying to figure out how to make those connections between practitioners and what the researchers are doing.
Yeah, and I'll just do a quick shout out to a couple of people that weren't able to join us, or we were trying to keep this initial one small, but some other people who are doing some really nice stuff. I think Will Tallheimer's stuff got mentioned, and so we'll put him in the show notes. Miriam Nealon, I know, Patti, you've done some stuff with her. She's doing a really nice blog that kind of does some research studies and things like that. Anybody else that we should be looking at? Those are the ones that are on my radar. Donald Clark. Yep.
Oh, yeah.
I was. He's got some good stuff. So we'll put links for that material in the show notes.
And Connie Muhammad.
Yeah. Oh, Connie, of course. Yep. So the last thing to do before we wrap up is just your shameless plug. Where can we find you? How can we engage with you on topics? What would you like to tell us about? Clark, do you want to go first?
Sure. Blog, learnlets.com. Thoughts that end up appearing in presentations and books tend to show up on my blog first. So a couple posts a week. I'm at quinnovation.com. I'm a consultant. I'm a gun for hire. Please. And you know, the Millennials book and 4 other books, one on games, one on mobile, and one on the revolution learning and development needs to have.
Okay, great. How about Jane?
I'm Jane Bozarth. I'm with the e-learning guild, elearningguild.com. I do the director of research there, but I also have a monthly column in Learning Solutions magazine, Nuts and Bolts, which is intended to be practical, quick, dirty, how to do this, especially if you're newer to it. I have a number of books out. The most recent one is Show Your Work, the how-tos and payoffs of working out loud, which is the fancier way of saying it is that we talk about making tacit learning more explicit and how to cross organizational silos and boundaries and get information shared more effectively in ways that help other people understand not just what you do, but how you get things done. And I will be at Learning Solutions at the end of the month. I think everybody here will be, maybe. Am I right?
I'll be there.
Are you coming?
Oh, good. We can do part 2 in person, maybe.
Okay.
So.
Patti says she's not there, so.
Oh, okay. Well, we can loop you in.
FaceTime.
All right, Patti, how about you? What's your shameless plug?
The easiest place to find me is on Amazon, Patti with an I, P-A-T-T-I-S-H-A-N-K. Those are where you can get my 3 books. And the best place to find what I'm thinking about every day is on elearningindustry.com. Just search my name, Patti with an I. And I write a monthly article for them.
All right, great. Tracy? Oh, Tracy, you're muted.
Technical monkeys not doing what they're supposed to do. I'm at Learning Solutions at the end of the month. I am at the Canadian e-learning conference in July in Toronto. I'd be happy for you to join us up there as well. And on Learn Chat, we've got Learn Chat this evening. So if you're on Twitter, you can check us out there. We are keeping notes from today's chat. So any of the links that have been mentioned, articles, books, I've collected them all and we will post those out in show notes somewhere. Follow Julie and I on Twitter. Julie is Usable Learning. I'm Tracy_Parrish on Twitter. And we also have Nerdy Shop Talk on Twitter. So just follow one of those and we'll get the notes out very soon. And Julie?
Yeah, so I am usablelearning.com is my consulting site, and I actually have a brand new online course site called designbetterlearning.com. And I have a new course on sticky learning. How do you make learning more engaging and have it stick with users? So that's very exciting. We haven't fully released it yet, but it's out there, and it explains why not everything has to be micro. And debugs the goldfish a little bit. So all of those kinds of things. And yeah, I also have a Facebook group for the book, which is designed for how people learn. And it's been turning into a really lovely community to have Nerdy Shop Talk about instructional design issues. So yeah, so we'll put all this stuff in the show notes. You can follow us on Twitter at Nerdy Shop Talk. And we'll make sure that we link out to the show notes and all of the resources that we've mentioned there. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. This has been great. Yay, this is my favorite thing.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks.